Murder beneath the silver-tide mystery manor of Greyhaven Hall. There are places where time seems to hesitate, where every shadow holds a memory, and every sound echoes a little too long. Greyhaven Abbey was such a place. It stood upon the western cliffs of Wales, a lonely silhouette against a restless sea, once a convent, later a girls' boarding school, and now little more than a relic of gentler centuries. The abbey carried its history like a widow wears her veil solemnly, silently, with secrets folded deep within its stones. On clear mornings, when the tide was low, one could hear the distant toll of its old chapel bell drifting across the water, faint, forlorn, and always a little out of time. Locals said the bell never rang without reason, and when it tolled that autumn dawn, heavy and low through the mist, every villager along the coast crossed themselves and closed their doors. By the hour the sun broke through, the body of Miss Helena Grey had been found at the foot of the chapel steps, her face white as the marble angels carved above her, her hands folded as if in prayer. It was said she had fallen. It was whispered she had been pushed. And from that morning onward, the abbey was never quite the same. 30 years later, when the waves still whispered her name, and the abbey's bell began to toll again, the villagers of Brinport spoke in hushed voices of the curse returning. But Hercule Poirot, summoned from London by an anxious letter, believed no such thing. He believed in reason, not ghosts in motive, not superstition. And yet, as he stepped from the motor car that rainy evening and looked up at the looming shadow of Greyhaven Abbey, even Poirot, precise, pragmatic, unflinching, felt the faintest chill of something he could not quite name. For some houses, he thought, remember, and some crimes, no matter how deeply buried, will not rest in peace. Chapter 1. The Gathering Storm. The Cornish coast, that autumn, had the peculiar beauty of a place half asleep beneath the weight of its own history. The sea stretched wide and pewter-coloured to the horizon, restless beneath a sky the colour of old parchment. Waves broke in white ribbons against the cliffs, and far above, gulls wheeled like pale scraps of paper on the wind. It was on such a morning that Monsieur Hercule Poirot arrived in the little village of Tregarron. His cab jolted to a stop beside the ivy-choked inn called the Siren's Rest, its sign creaking in the wind. The driver, red-cheeked and smelling faintly of salt, leaned down from his seat. "Storm due by nightfall, sir. Best you stay inside once it hits. The cliffs aren't kind to strangers after dark." Poirot, stepping down with his usual care, adjusted his hat and surveyed the sky. "Mais oui, the English weather, it possesses the temperament of a jealous woman. One moment she smiles, the next she throws her dishes." He paid the man and with a faint smile turned to the inn door. Inside, the Siren's Rest was warm, dimly lit, and faintly scented with smoke and seaweed. The proprietress, Mrs. Ellen Prowse, emerged from behind the counter, a thin woman with a voice like weathered wood. "Room for you, sir. Not many folk come this time of year, not with the silver tide due." Poirot lifted one dark eyebrow. "The silver tide, madame?" She nodded, leaning closer. "It happens once every 10 years or so. Moonlight turns the water pale as mercury and the waves glow. Beautiful, they say, but ill luck follows. My father swore it brings a death to every house that watches it." Poirot inclined his head gravely. "Ah, then perhaps I shall not watch, only listen. The sea, she tells her stories well enough, n'est-ce pas?" Prowse smiled despite herself, and handed him the key to room 3. "If you need company, there's a fire downstairs. You'll find plenty of talk tonight. Greyhaven Hall is having their gathering, and that always stirs up the village." "Greyhaven Hall," Poirot repeated softly, savouring the sound. "I have heard this name. A family of distinction and of troubles?" Ellen Prowse's expression turned wary. "That's as may be. Sir Alaric Greyhaven died last month, God rest him. They're reading his will tonight up at the hall. All the kin come down for it, even those we've not seen for years. And a rough sea to greet them, too. It never bodes well when money and memory meet." Poirot thanked her and carried his small valise upstairs. His room was modest, but neat. White curtains fluttered at the window, and beyond them the cliffs fell away to the endless sea. On the horizon, clouds were gathering dark, slow, inevitable. He unpacked with his usual precision, setting his brushes, ties, and small mirror in symmetrical order upon the dressing table. Yet his gaze returned again and again to the view. The sea possessed a curious power to unsettle him, not because it was wild, but because it was formless, incapable of being ordered or measured. A detective, Poirot thought, prefers the straight line, the tidy pattern. The ocean offered only chaos disguised as beauty. He smiled faintly. "Then perhaps," he murmured, "it is well that I rest among the chaos for a few days." That evening, as the lamps were lit and the storm rolled nearer, Poirot descended to the common room. A handful of villagers huddled round the hearth, exchanging stories over mugs of ale. The talk inevitably turned to Greyhaven Hall. "A cursed place," muttered an old fisherman named Garth. "Ever since Sir Alaric took to shutting himself away. You'll see something'll come of that will tonight. The silver tide takes its due." His companion, a younger man with a scarred hand, scoffed. "You and your superstitions. It's money that brings trouble, not the sea." "Money," Garth said, "and guilt." Poirot listened with the politeness of one accustomed to finding meaning in idle chatter. From their talk he gathered the sketch of the family. The proud widow, Lady Margaret; the son, Julian, once the toast of London, now a gambler in disgrace; the daughter, Clara, too proud for her poverty; and Edward Vale, the family solicitor who had served both father and son. "Lady Margaret's kept the place running with what's left," Ellen Prowse added quietly. "But there's talk Sir Alaric changed his will before he died. And if he did, well, there'll be bad blood at Greyhaven tonight." Poirot glanced toward the window. The rain had begun, fine and relentless. Thunder murmured somewhere beyond the hills. "Perhaps," he said, "it is best that families who quarrel should have their words drowned by the sound of the storm. It prevents them from hearing themselves too clearly." Laughter followed, but Mrs. Prowse only shook her head. "You've a way of speaking, sir. You're not from around here, are you?" Poirot bowed slightly. "From Belgium, madame. A humble seeker of order in a disorderly world." If she found the reply curious, she did not press. The clock struck 8, and the conversation broke up. The villagers went their separate ways, hurrying home before the worst of the rain. Poirot lingered by the fire, staring into the coals. Through the open door, he could hear the wind rising, whipping against the sign outside. Somewhere far above the inn, the sea boomed against the cliffs like a slow-beating drum. By the time Poirot retired to bed, the storm had arrived in earnest. Rain lashed the windows, the timbers of the inn groaned. Sleep was a fragile thing, easily lost. At intervals he heard the thunder, the hiss of waves, and once the faint toll of a bell carried down from the cliffs. The next morning, when he descended for breakfast, the air was heavy and grey. Mrs. Prowse was already waiting with tea and toast. "Heard the news, sir. They say one of the Greyhavens sent for the constable in the night. Something amiss at the hall." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Indeed? A quarrel, perhaps?" She shook her head slowly. "No, sir. They say it's worse than that. One of them didn't live to see the dawn." Poirot set down his cup, the faintest sigh escaping him. "Ah, so the silver tide keeps her promise once again." He reached for his hat and coat, the little grey cells already stirring with quiet purpose. "Madam," he said gently, "might one find the way to Greyhaven Hall on foot?" And so began the case that Cornwall would whisper about for years to come, the case of the family, the fortune, and the body that fell beneath the silver tide. Chapter 2. The Will of the Dead. The path to Greyhaven Hall wound upward through the moors, narrow and rain-slick, bordered by gorse and heather. Though the storm had passed, the morning carried its ghost. Low fog clung to the earth like smoke, and the sea murmured far below, still restless, as though uneasy after what it had witnessed in the dark. Hercule Poirot walked with measured steps, umbrella neatly furled beneath one arm. The landscape, bleak, untamed, seemed to resist order. Stones jutted from the earth like half-buried gravestones, and the air smelled of salt and sorrow. Yet even here, Poirot's mind worked with clockwork calm. Her death in the night, at the reading of a will it was, he reflected, a pattern as old as greed itself. Always, he murmured, it is the family who quarrel over money. They quarrel when they have it, and they quarrel when they do not. The English, they say little of love but speak so freely of inheritance. As he crested the final rise, the hall came into view. Greyhaven Hall stood like a brooding sentinel against the cliffs. Once a proud manor of Georgian grace, it now bore the marks of time and neglect. Windows shuttered, ivy crawling across its facade, the roof dark with moss. Below, the sea struck the rocks in slow, deliberate blows. At the gate stood a constable, his cap pulled low against the damp. "Sorry, sir, no one's to enter family business, police matter." Poirot inclined his head politely. "I am aware, mon ami. However, you may tell your inspector that Monsieur Hercule Poirot presents his respects. It is possible," he added with quiet emphasis, "that I may be of service." The name carried weight even here. Within minutes the constable returned, somewhat chastened. "Inspector Harding asks you to come in, sir. Says he's heard of you from Scotland Yard." "Bien," Poirot said simply, and followed the man through the gates. Inside, the hall was vast and echoing, its corridors dim, lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to follow every visitor. The scent of wax polish and damp wood hung heavy in the air. In the drawing-room, several figures were gathered, each distinct in posture, yet bound by the same invisible tension. At the hearth stood Lady Margaret Greyhaven, tall and austere in mourning black. Her once beautiful face had hardened into lines of command. Her silver hair was drawn back with almost military precision. Beside her, pale and nervous, sat Clara Greyhaven, her daughter fragile, wide-eyed, clutching a handkerchief she never used. At the window, staring out to sea, was Julian Greyhaven, the prodigal son, handsome still but hollow-eyed, his charm frayed by years of carelessness, and at the writing desk, papers scattered before him, was Edward Vale, the family solicitor, grey-haired, composed, but with the weary caution of a man accustomed to secrets. Inspector Hardinge, broad and sandy-haired, turned from the fireplace as Poirot entered. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, appreciate your coming. We've a bit of a situation." Poirot surveyed the room with a single sweeping glance that took in every shadow, every tremor of the hand. "You have a death, yes?" Hardinge nodded. "Sir Alaric's nephew, Mr. Philip Greyhaven, found dead at 2:30 out on the terrace. Broken neck, likely from a fall, but the ground was slick with rain, and there are questions." "Questions," Poirot repeated softly, "always arrive with death. Tell me, if you please, why was he upon the terrace in the storm?" "That's what we're trying to learn," Harding said. The family were gathered for the reading of the will. Tempers ran high. The servants say there was shouting, mostly between Julian and Philip. The lights went out when the storm hit, and by the time they came back on, Philip was gone. "They found him below the terrace not long after." Lady Margaret's voice cut through the air, brittle and cold. "It was an accident. Philip drank too much. He slipped. That's all there is to it." Poirot bowed slightly. "Madame, you speak with the firmness of conviction. Yet forgive me, sometimes conviction conceals uncertainty." Her eyes flashed. "I will not have scandal in this house, Monsieur Poirot." "Then let us hope," he said gently. "That scandal will not have you." A silence followed, heavy, crackling. When the inspector excused himself to see the body, Poirot lingered, his gaze wandering the room. He observed the faint scorch mark near the hearth, the half-drained glasses upon the sideboard, the scattering of papers where the will had been read. One page lay crumpled underfoot, a copy of Sir Alaric's final testament. He stooped to retrieve it. The ink was fresh, the handwriting unmistakably deliberate. But in the margin, someone had scrawled 3 words in haste. "It was promised." Poirot's brows lifted. "Curious," he murmured. "A promise to the living or the dead?" Edward Vale cleared his throat. "That note has nothing to do with the matter, monsieur. Merely a private comment of Sir Alaric's." "Ah," said Poirot. "Private things, monsieur, have a way of becoming most public, especially when there is death." He turned toward the window. From there he could see the terrace, still slick with rain, the stone balustrade broken where someone had fallen. Beyond, the cliffs plunged to the churning water below. Even now the tide was turning silver with the approach of dusk. Later that afternoon, Poirot joined Inspector Hardinge in the library, where Philip's body had been laid out. The dead man's expression was oddly peaceful, though a faint bruise marked his temple. Hardinge spoke quietly. "Doctor says it could have been the fall that killed him, or a blow beforehand. There's no way to be sure yet." Poirot bent closer, eyes narrowing. "To the shoes," he said suddenly. "See, they are clean. And yet the terrace was soaked with mud. How does one fall without leaving the trace of where one has walked?" Hardinge frowned. "You think he was moved?" Poirot shrugged delicately. "I think perhaps he never walked out to the terrace at all." He straightened, fingertips pressed together. "Mon ami, let us speak again to this family. They are each wearing masks, but masks, as you know, can slip." By evening the storm had returned in whispers. Poirot sat once more in the drawing-room with the family assembled before him. The fire cast long, trembling shadows. "Tell me," Poirot began, "what happened last night after the will was read?" Julian Greyhaven gave a bitter laugh. "What happens in any house when there's not enough money to go round? Arguments, accusations. Father left most of it to charity, you see, to restore the church of all things. Philip called it madness. I called it robbery. That's when he stormed out. And you followed him?" Julian's smile faltered. "I tried, but the lights went out and I couldn't see a thing." "Convenient," Lady Margaret murmured, her voice sharp. "You and Philip quarrelled the most." Clara turned to her mother. "Please stop." "Philip was dreadful to everyone. He said horrid things about Father, about you." Her voice shook. "But he didn't deserve to die." Poirot regarded her gently. "Mademoiselle, one does not die because one deserves it. One dies because someone decides it." The words fell into the hush like pebbles into deep water. When at last Poirot took his leave, the night had thickened and the moon was rising a pale, ghostly coin over the sea. The tide shimmered faintly, as if lit from within. He paused at the terrace where Philip had fallen, and for a long while he stood in silence. The wind sighed through the ivy, carrying the faintest echo of laughter, distant, or perhaps remembered, mon Dieu, he whispered. "The silver tide has claimed its first, but she is greedy, cette mère. She will not be satisfied with one." Chapter 3. The letter in the wall morning came reluctantly to Greyhaven Hall. The sea mist, heavy and unbroken, drifted against the windows like breath on glass. Inside the great house lay hushed, its silence that of exhaustion rather than peace. Somewhere a clock ticked, steady, relentless, marking time for a man who would not wake again. Poirot sat at the breakfast table alone, the silver teapot steaming beside him, a slice of toast untouched. His gaze was distant, fixed on nothing. In truth, he was listening, to the creaks in the beams, to the muted stirrings of servants, to the way voices travelled through a house that tried very hard to keep its secrets. He had learned long ago that guilt speaks first not in words, but in the way silence changes its shape. A knock came at the door. It was Inspector Hardinge, looking harried, his coat damp with the morning fog. "Morning, Monsieur Poirot. We've made some progress. There's something you'll want to see." He led Poirot along the dim corridor to a narrow stairwell that descended toward the servants' wing. The plaster here was cracked, the walls marked by water stains. At the bottom, Hardinge stopped before a section of panelling newly exposed. "Housemaid found it while dusting," he said. "Loose board. Look what's inside." He pried the panel open, revealing a small cavity. Within it lay a single folded letter, yellowed with age and sealed with a blob of dark red wax. Across the envelope, in a hand both elegant and trembling, were written 3 words, "For my confessor." Poirot lifted it delicately, turning it beneath the light. No date, the handwriting very refined. This, I think, belonged to Sir Alaric himself. He broke the seal with care. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink faded but legible. "I have sinned beyond redemption. The sea will not forgive me, nor will those who bear my name. When the tide turns silver again, I shall keep my promise, or another will keep it for me." Hardinge frowned. "You think that's what this is about? Some promise he made?" Poirot's eyes gleamed faintly. "Perhaps, or perhaps someone believed it was a promise made to them. You see, mon ami, promises, like debts, do not always die with the man who made them. Later that morning, Poirot requested to see the family once more. They gathered reluctantly in the small morning room overlooking the cliffs. The sea below was hidden by mist. It might as well have been the edge of the world. He held up the letter without a word. Lady Margaret's hand tightened on her shawl. "Where did you find that?" "In the servants' corridor," Poirot replied. "Hidden for perhaps many years. It speaks of a promise, of a sin, and of the silver tide. Madame, does this phrase mean something to you?" Her face remained composed, but her eyes flickered a brief, involuntary tremor. "No, it's an old superstition. The locals call the bioluminescent tide by that name. They say it appears once every 10 years. Ridiculous nonsense. Ah, but superstition often hides a truth," Poirot said gently. "And truth, madame, has the inconvenient habit of returning when one least expects it." Julian, pale and irritable, broke in. "Are we to spend the morning on fairy tales?" "My cousin is dead, and we're being interrogated over glowing waves." Poirot turned to him unoffended. "Monsieur Greyhaven, anger is often a shield. When one feels it so strongly, it is because one fears what lies beneath." Julian gave a short, brittle laugh. "You think I killed Philip? He was my cousin, not my friend. But if you want a villain, look to the solicitor. He's been lying to this family for years." All eyes turned to Edward Vale, who stood by the mantelpiece, stiff as a soldier. "That's absurd," he said quietly. "My duty has always been to the estate." "Indeed," Poirot murmured. "And yet the will you read last night, it was written only a week before Sir Alaric's death." "That is not so, Inspector." Hardinger nodded. "Dated the 12th, Poirot continued softly. "Sir Alaric was ill for months. Why make such changes at the end? And why entrust them to a man outside the family?" He looked directly at Vale. Was there pressure, perhaps? Or a secret that required protection? Vale met his gaze for a long moment, then looked away. "You're asking questions to which you already know the answers, Monsieur Poirot." Poirot inclined his head. "And yet I ask them still." When the questioning ended, Poirot walked alone through the long corridor that led toward the chapel. He found Clara Greyhaven sitting on a pew, her hands folded in her lap. The dim light fell through the stained glass in patterns of blue and green, the colors of the sea. "You do not pray, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked gently. She startled slightly, then shook her head. "Not any more. I used to when I was a child. Father said prayers were just another form of wishful thinking. He said the sea listened better." "The sea, perhaps," Poirot murmured, "but she is not generous in her answers." She looked up at him. "Do you believe in curses, Monsieur Poirot?" He smiled faintly. "I believe that guilt, when left unspoken, behaves like a curse. It finds a way to surface, whether in dreams or in tragedy." Clara turned away. "I heard them arguing last night. Julian and Philip. It was about money, of course. But Philip said something strange before he left the room. He said, 'The promise was never yours to keep.' Then the lights went out." Poirot regarded her quietly. "Thank you, mademoiselle. You have told me the truth, or at least a truth." That evening, when the household had retreated to their rooms, Poirot returned to the library. The fire had burned low. He sat at the desk where the will had been read, tapping his fingertips together. The phrase circled in his mind. The promise was never yours to keep. He unfolded the old letter once more. The handwriting trembled slightly, not from age but from fear. Sir Alaric had confessed to a sin of blood, a promise to be kept when the tide turned silver again, and a death that came precisely on the eve of that tide. Poirot's gaze shifted to the portrait above the hearth, Sir Alaric himself, painted in his youth. The man's eyes were sharp, restless, almost pleading. "There is a pattern here," Poirot whispered. "A thread that begins in the past and ends in the present, perhaps even beneath this very floor." He stood, candle in hand, and traced the edge of the panelling along the north wall. Near the corner, one board gave a hollow sound when tapped. He pressed it gently, and it moved, revealing a small recess. Inside was another envelope, this one unsealed. The handwriting was different, feminine, and across it was scrawled, "For him who forgives nothing." Poirot drew a long breath. Mon Dieu! Another voice in the confession. He slipped the letter into his pocket, closed the panel carefully, and extinguished the candle. The sea's low hum filled the silence. Somewhere outside, the wind carried a faint, silvery shimmer of light, the tide beginning its eerie glow, and Poirot knew then, with a cold certainty, that the promise had not yet been kept. Chapter 4. The chapel at the edge of the sea by morning. The mist had not lifted, it had thickened. The entire coast seemed drowned in it, a pale moving wall through which the faint roar of the sea could be heard, distant and hollow. The gulls' cries were muted, as though the air itself had swallowed their voices. Poirot stood at the window of his small room, immaculate as always, his moustache neatly combed, his suit perfectly pressed, despite the dampness that seemed to creep through the very walls. He stared out toward the cliffs, though they were invisible, lost beyond the curtain of fog. Somewhere out there, he knew, was the old chapel, and beneath it, the crypt that local superstition whispered about in half-remembered tones. When Inspector Hastings arrived, his coat beaded with mist, Poirot greeted him with a nod. "You have slept badly, mon ami." Hastings grunted. "I've been down to the shore since dawn." The tide came in heavy. "Washed away most of the footprints from last night." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, the sea, she cleans too well, but sometimes she leaves behind what she wishes us to see." He reached into his pocket and withdrew the second letter he had found behind the library panel. "There is something we must examine. Not in this house, but at the edge of it, where Faith once lived. The chapel." "Just so," Poirot said quietly. "I believe that what began in Greyhaven Hall long ago began also there, at the chapel by the sea. The path to the chapel was narrow and treacherous, winding along the cliffside where sea spray stung the face and the ground gave beneath the feet. The fog parted only in breaths, revealing the faint outline of a ruined steeple. The building, when at last they reached it, stood like a ghost of Faith, roof half collapsed, ivy crawling across the stone, a bell long fallen and cracked beside the steps. Through the broken arch of the doorway came the damp scent of salt and decay. Inside, the light was dim and greenish, filtering through panes streaked with moss. The air was chill and water dripped somewhere unseen. A few rows of pews still stood, warped by years of neglect. At the front, the altar leaned crookedly, the candle holders rusted, and behind it a narrow stairway descended into darkness. Hastings frowned. "You think there's something down there?" Poirot gestured delicately. "A place of burial, perhaps, but more importantly a place of remembrance. And remembrance, my friend, is where truth hides." They descended slowly, Poirot's small electric lamp casting a narrow circle of light. The steps were slick with moisture, the air close and heavy. At the bottom lay a low crypt, its ceiling arched and walls carved roughly from stone. Coffins lined one side, some collapsed, others covered with rotting drapery. Poirot moved with care, scanning the ground. Then his beam caught something small, pale, half buried near the far wall. He stooped and lifted it. It was a silver locket, tarnished, its clasp broken. Inside was a miniature portrait of a woman, dark-haired, fine-featured, with a serene expression and the unmistakable eyes of the Greyhaven family. Hastings peered over his shoulder. "Lady Margaret?" Poirot shook his head slowly. "No, not quite. There is a resemblance, yes, but softer, humbler. This is someone of the same blood, yet not of the same name. Perhaps," he paused, considering, "perhaps the one whose child bore that name without right." He opened the locket's second compartment and found a folded scrap of paper within. It was nearly illegible, but two words were still visible. "Forgive him." Poirot's face grew grave. "This, Inspector, is the voice of the woman who wrote the letter I found. For him who forgives nothing." She spoke not of herself, but of Sir Alaric. Hastings frowned. "And what of it?" "The man's been dead a month." "Ah," Poirot said softly, "but death, mon ami, is only the last link in a very long chain. We must follow it back, to where the first betrayal began." They left the crypt and stood for a time outside the chapel. The fog had thinned. Faint light shimmered on the sea far below. It was near noon, yet the horizon glowed with an odd silvery sheen. Hastings looked uneasy. "Locals say the silver tide's due to appear tonight. Folk superstition, of course, but Poirot finished, superstition has a way of shaping behavior. Someone in this house, Inspector, Believes that the silver tide demands payment. They turned back toward the hall. That evening, Poirot dined with the family once again. The atmosphere was tense, brittle, like a glass too thin for its contents. Conversation faltered, glances darted, and beneath every word hummed the question none dared ask aloud. Who among them was a murderer? At last Poirot spoke. This afternoon, Inspector Hardinge and I visited the chapel. We found something that belonged, I think, to this house. He placed the silver locket upon the table. Its dull gleam caught the firelight. Lady Margaret's breath caught audibly. Clara gave a small gasp. Julian's glass halted midway to his lips. "Do any of you recognize it?" Poirot asked. No one answered. Then Clara whispered, "It belonged to my grandmother. Father used to say she was a saint. Her name was Helena. She died before I was born." Poirot nodded. "And yet she was buried, not in the family vault, but beneath the chapel by the sea." Margaret's composure broke for the first time. "That's not true. She was buried properly here on the estate." "No, madam," Poirot interrupted gently. "Her coffin is there, I have seen it. Sir Alaric chose to hide her, and now, even after his death, her memory returns, as though she will not rest until her story is told." Julian slammed his glass down, shattering it. "What are you implying, Poirot? That our father murdered his own mother?" Poirot's voice remained calm, almost kind. "Non, monsieur. That he sinned against her, and that someone among you, in seeking to avenge or conceal that sin, has shed blood again." A long silence followed. The only sound was the wind pressing against the windows and the slow hiss of the fire. When the family dispersed at last, Poirot remained by the hearth. Hardinge joined him, his expression troubled. "You've stirred them up, all right. But what now? We've still got no proof, no weapon, no clear motive." Poirot turned the locket over in his hand. "We have enough. Tonight the silver tide returns, and with it I think our murderer will act again." "Again?" Hardinge said sharply. "You think there'll be another attempt?" Poirot's eyes were fixed on the sea through the tall windows. Beyond the glass the fog had lifted entirely, and a strange radiance shimmered on the waves, faint, luminous, otherworldly. "Oui," he said softly. "The pattern will complete itself. The promise must be kept, and before dawn one more truth will rise from the depths." He glanced at the clock. "At midnight, mon ami, we shall go to the cliffs." Chapter 5. The promise of the silver tide. By midnight the sea had turned to liquid silver. The phenomenon the locals called the silver tide came but once a year, when the moon rose full and the phosphorescent plankton in the shallows shone so bright that the waves themselves seemed aflame. The cliffs of Greyhaven were aglow with that ghostly light, and the wind carried a low hum, like some unearthly hymn. Poirot stood at the window of the library, coat buttoned, hat in hand, his reflection pale against the glass. Behind him, the grandfather clock ticked toward 12. Inspector Hardinge paced impatiently, glancing at the open notebook on the table. "You're certain the killer will act tonight?" he muttered. Poirot's moustache twitched faintly. "When a pattern reveals itself, one must follow it to its end. The first death came on the night of the new moon, when darkness ruled. The second—" He stopped. Hardinge frowned. "The second what?" Poirot turned from the window. "The second comes when the light returns, when secrets cannot hide even in the depths." The clock struck 12. A single, clear note rang out, and somewhere far below, another sound answered, the toll of the chapel bell, though it had long been broken. The echo rolled up the cliffs and through the corridors of Greyhaven Hall, ancient and mournful. Hardinge froze. That can't be possible. The bell's been down for years." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Then someone has found a way to make it speak again." They took the coastal path, lanterns swinging in the wind, their steps echoing off the wet stones. The silver tide shimmered far below, the waves bright as molten glass. Clouds drifted across the moon, and each shadow made the sea seem to breathe. As they neared the chapel, they saw a faint light flickering within. Poirot motioned for silence and moved closer. Through the broken archway, they could see a single candle burning on the altar, and before it, a figure kneeling. It was Lady Margaret. Her hair had come loose, her hands clasped tightly, her voice low and trembling as she prayed. "Forgive me, Helena. Forgive what we did. Let it end tonight. Hardinge started forward, but Poirot caught his arm. No, wait. There is another. A second figure moved in the shadows behind her, taller, slighter, Clara. Her face was pale, eyes shining with tears. In her hand she held something small and metallic. The light glinted. A pistol. Poirot stepped forward then, voice calm but commanding. Mademoiselle Clara, you will put down the weapon if you please. Clara gasped, turning sharply. The gun wavered. Stay back. You don't understand. It has to end tonight. Lady Margaret rose slowly, horror in her face. Clara, my dear child, what are you doing? Poirot advanced one step. You wish to avenge, not to end. There is a difference. Your grandmother Helena was wronged, yes, but this is not her justice. It is your guilt. Clara's voice broke. He killed her, Poirot. He buried her like a shameful secret. Father knew. He kept it all quiet. And when I found the letters, he burned them. Poirot's eyes softened. And so you planned to punish him as he punished her. To make the family pay in blood. Her hands trembled. He didn't deserve peace. Margaret stepped closer, her voice trembling. Clara, listen to me. We all suffered. We all sinned. But murder. The pistol fired. The sound cracked through the chapel, swallowed by the roar of the wind. For an instant all was silver and flame. Then silence. Lady Margaret fell to her knees. The bullet had missed her, struck the altar behind. The candle had gone out. When the smoke cleared, Clara was standing still, eyes wide, gun slipping from her fingers. Poirot was beside her in an instant, his hand gentle on her arm. Enough, mademoiselle, he said softly. It is finished. She looked at him through tears. I wanted to end the curse. Poirot shook his head. Curses are not ended by death, but by truth. By dawn the storm had passed. The silver tide faded with the light, and the cliffs lay quiet once more. Poirot stood outside the chapel, watching the sea. The inspector joined him, weary but thoughtful. So that's it, Hardinge murmured. She confessed. Said she meant to frighten her aunt, not kill anyone. Said the first victim, the butler, caught her searching for the diary and she panicked. Poirot nodded. It was not hatred that drove her, but sorrow. She loved her grandmother's memory too fiercely, and grief turned her reason astray. He looked toward the horizon, where the last of the moon still hung, pale and ghostly. Do you see, Inspector? Each year the silver tide returns, not to claim lives, but to reveal what the dark has hidden. Tonight it revealed the heart of the house itself. Hardinge frowned. And what's that, Poirot? Poirot smiled faintly. A family that has lived too long by silence. Now perhaps they will learn to speak. That night, before leaving Greyhaven Hall, Poirot visited the chapel one last time. The sea was calm, the moon low. He placed the tarnished locket upon the altar, beside the broken bell rope. Rest, Madame Helena, he murmured. Your secret is known. Your peace is earned. Then he turned and with his small, precise footsteps walked away into the dawn. Chapter 6. The Diary of the Dead. The morning after the storm dawned pale and brittle. Greyhaven Hall lay under a stillness that was almost unnatural, as though the great house itself held its breath, afraid to disturb what the night had left behind. The gulls wheeled low over the cliffs, their cries faint against the sigh of the sea. In the library, Hercule Poirot sat at the long oak table, his coffee untouched, a small black notebook open before him. His head was slightly bent, his moustache perfectly symmetrical despite the sleepless night. Before him lay the object that had survived every fire, flood and silence of the family, Helena's diary. It was smaller than he had imagined, bound in faded blue leather, the edges frayed by time. The clasp was broken, the pages unevenly cut, some darker than others. Poirot turned each leaf with the reverence of a priest handling relics. Across from him, Inspector Hardinge slouched in a chair, hat in hand, his tone impatient. She confessed, didn't she? Clara. The girl's distraught, but she as good as admitted to killing the butler and trying to shoot her aunt. Seems straightforward to me. Poirot lifted his gaze, his eyes bright and knowing. Mon ami, nothing is straightforward when grief and guilt dance together. Mademoiselle Clara's tears are real, but her confession is not the whole truth. Hardinge frowned. You mean someone else put her up to it? Poirot smiled faintly. Perhaps, or perhaps she was led to believe what someone wished her to believe. He tapped the diary. This is the voice of the dead, yes. But even the dead may be made to speak lies. As the inspector left, Poirot began to read aloud in a soft murmur, letting the rhythm of the words sink into the silence. March 17th. He is gone again to the sea. I hear the gulls scream his name. There is a sin that cannot be washed away no matter how the waves rise. I shall hide it where no one will look, where salt meets stone. Poirot read on, his mind measuring the cadence, the ink, the faint irregularities in the handwriting. Halfway through the diary, the writing changed, subtly but distinctly. The slant became sharper, the loops of the letters smaller, the pressure heavier. He leaned closer. Ah, a forger who believes imitation is perfection, but the hand betrays the heart. The later entries, Mon cher Helena, were not yours. From the doorway came a soft voice. You noticed it too. It was Beatrice, the housekeeper, thin as a candle and twice as silent. She carried a tray, her eyes lowered. I thought perhaps you'd like some tea, sir. You've not eaten. Poirot smiled gently. Merci, Madame Beatrice. Tell me, you knew Madame Helena well? Beatrice hesitated. I was a scullery maid then. But yes, I remember her voice. Kind, though sad. The night she died, the sea was wild. They said she slipped while walking by the cliffs. I never believed that. Poirot watched her closely. And you kept her things? A flicker of surprise. Her things? No, sir. The master ordered them burned. All except that diary. Said it was. Sentimental, Poirot murmured. Sentimental or dangerous? Beatrice glanced toward the corridor, lowered her voice. The truth, sir. That diary wasn't even in her room when she died. Mr. Alastair, her husband, had it. He kept it in his study until the night after the funeral. Then one morning it was gone. Gone, Poirot repeated softly. And when did it reappear? 5 years later, when Lady Margaret found it among old papers. He looked down again at the pages. The ink of the latter half was indeed newer, and the handwriting's tremor suggested age. Not youth, Lady Margaret, he said quietly. You are too precise for your own good. By noon, Poirot was in her drawing-room, the diary in hand. Lady Margaret sat by the fire, her hands folded neatly, her face pale but composed. You have been busy, Monsieur Poirot, she said. I suppose you've come to return that dreadful thing. No, he replied, taking a chair. I have come to ask why you altered it. She did not flinch, though a muscle in her jaw moved. Altered? Do not mistake me, madam. You are a woman of order. I see it in your handwriting, your ledgers, your letters. And here, he opened the diary to the forged section. Your hand has left its signature in every line. Margaret's composure wavered. You accuse me of forging my mother's words. I accuse you, Poirot said softly, of protecting your family at any cost. Even from the truth, her eyes glistened. You think I enjoyed reading that diary? Seeing her write about her shame, her husband's cruelty, my father's weakness? No, Monsieur Poirot. I rewrote it to spare us, to spare Clara. The truth would have destroyed her. Poirot's tone was gentle. But in so doing, you destroyed another, the faithful butler who saw you removing the real diary from the safe. He threatened to reveal it, and you silenced him. Margaret's breath caught. I never know, perhaps not by your own hand, Poirot interrupted softly. But you set the stage. You let the legend of Helena's ghost grow. Let Clara believe in a curse. And someone, perhaps your loyal servant, perhaps another, took advantage of that fear to kill in her name. She turned away, trembling. You don't understand what this family has suffered. Poirot rose. On the contrary, madame. I understand perfectly. The sins of the past are like the tide, they always return. That night Poirot returned to his room overlooking the sea. The diary lay open beside him, and outside the window the tide whispered against the rocks, slow, steady, eternal. He wrote a few neat lines in his own notebook. The forgery confirms premeditation. The motive, protection, pride, guilt. But there remains one question. Who killed the solicitor? He knew too much. The sea may have taken him, or someone helped it along. Poirot set down his pen and smiled faintly. Tomorrow, he murmured. The attic shall tell its story. The waves sighed below as though in answer. Chapter 7. Echoes in the attic. The day after his conversation with Lady Margaret, Hercule Poirot woke with a singular purpose. The fog had lifted from the cliffs, leaving behind a brittle, watery light that made every window gleam like a mirror. The house, too, seemed to have shifted, as though its secrets had grown restless in their hiding places. Poirot, perfectly dressed as ever, took a measured breakfast, adjusted his tie with care, and announced to Inspector Hardinge, "Today, my friend, we go upstairs, to where memory keeps its dust." Hardinge groaned. "You mean the attic?" "We've already searched the place once." "Ah," said Poirot, eyes twinkling, "but not with order in the mind. It is not enough to look. One must see. Come." The staircase to the attic was narrow and steep, lined with portraits whose eyes followed them in silence. Dust lay thick on the banister, and each step creaked as if whispering warnings to the intruder. At the top was a small iron-bolted door. Beatrice, the housekeeper, handed Poirot the key with a trembling hand. "No one's been up there in years," she murmured. "Not since Miss Helena died. She kept her things there, and after. Well, Lady Margaret said it was better left closed." Poirot inclined his head. "The past, Madame Beatrice, is never closed. It merely waits for us to reopen it." The door gave way with a sigh, and a breath of cold air escaped, thick with dust and salt. The attic stretched wide beneath the eaves, trunks, furniture draped in sheets, broken picture frames, all lost beneath time's grey veil. Shafts of light cut through the grime-coated windows, turning the motes into drifting constellations. Poirot stood perfectly still. "Do you hear it?" Hardinge frowned. "Hear what?" "The sea," Poirot whispered. "Even here she speaks. It was true." The distant murmur of the tide rose through the stones of Greyhaven Hall, rhythmic as a heartbeat. They began their search systematically, Poirot directing, Hardinge muttering. Old linens, books, children's toys. Hardinge listed. Nothing of interest. Poirot ignored him. He had paused before a stack of crates marked with fading ink. H.M. 1893. Inside, beneath yellowed letters and a small carved box, he found a packet of envelopes bound with a fraying ribbon. The handwriting was elegant, slanted unmistakably Helena's. Poirot drew a slow breath. Voila, the true diary, the voice that was silenced. He opened the first letter. The ink was faded but legible. "Dearest Margaret, if ever you read this, know that I have loved you despite my failings. The truth may never be spoken aloud, but your father did not mean for death to come that night. It was an accident born of anger and fear. Forgive him and forgive me for what I must hide." Poirot read in silence. Each letter deepened the tragedy. Helena had not been murdered, as the family legend claimed, but had died trying to protect her husband from ruin after a quarrel on the cliffs. The cover-up, the shame, the curse, all of it had been built on guilt and silence. But something else caught Poirot's attention. A second handwriting, in pencil, at the bottom of one of the letters. "A later note. A man's hand. If this is found, destroy it. They must never know." J.H. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "J.H.," he murmured. "Not Helena's husband. His name was Alistair." "Then who?" Hardinge leaned over his shoulder. "Jasper Holloway, the solicitor." "Just so," Poirot said softly. "The same solicitor who vanished 3 days ago and was found dead upon the shore." They carried the letters downstairs, where the light fell clean and strong through the library windows. Poirot laid them out in precise order, aligning corners, reading the signatures, examining ink tones. His mind worked like a clock of perfect design, ticking toward revelation. "Observe, Inspector," he said. "Each letter begins with affection, ends with regret, until this one." He pointed to a page near the end. "This was never sent. It is a confession in draft. She speaks of a witness, someone who saw her husband's crime and threatened blackmail. She names him only as the man with the red scarf." Hardinge frowned. "We've no one here who wears a red scarf." Poirot smiled slightly. "No one now, but perhaps once long ago." He rose, dusting his hands. "Come, Inspector. There is more yet. The attic gives us the voice of the dead, but I wish also to hear from the living. There are 2 people who remember that night, Beatrice the maid and Lady Margaret herself. One tells the truth out of fear. The other hides it out of love." Before evening, Poirot returned to the attic once more, alone. He walked slowly to the window that overlooked the cliffs. The sun was low, gilding the waves in gold. Beneath the window, half hidden by a broken chest, something glinted, a small object wrapped in lace. He knelt and drew it out, a locket identical to the one Lady Margaret always wore. But this one was tarnished, its chain broken. Inside, two miniatures faced each other. Helena and a young man with piercing blue eyes, not Alistair, but Jasper Holloway. Poirot's brow furrowed. "So," he whispered, "the solicitor was more than a family friend, and the family secret runs deeper still." When he emerged from the attic, the light had dimmed, and the house seemed to hold its breath again. Poirot paused at the stairhead, glancing once toward the sea. "The tide is turning," he murmured, "and soon so will the truth." Chapter 8. The Third Death. The storm had left the Cornish coast raw and glistening. Greyhaven's lawns were strewn with seaweed and fragments of slate, shaken loose from the roof. By mid-morning, a cry rose from the fishermen below the cliffs, another body in the surf. Inspector Harding came to the library, white-faced and wet-booted. "Found him just past the jetty," he said. "The solicitor Holloway. Looks like he went over the edge sometime in the night." Tide carried him to the cove. Poirot closed the letter he had been studying. Enfin, the sea returns what was stolen. They went down together to the little stone mortuary by the harbour. Rain drummed upon the slate roof. The smell of brine hung heavy in the air. The body of Jasper Holloway lay on a table, his clothes stiff with salt, one hand clenched tight around a chain of gold. Hardinge leaned closer. "That locket again. Matches the one Lady Margaret wears." Poirot nodded. "Except that this one was Helena's. We saw her portrait within. And you observe he held it even as he died. Not suicide, my friend. A drowning man does not grasp a keepsake before he leaps. He clutches at life." He pointed delicately with his gloved finger. There beneath the thumb. A bruise shaped like a ring. Someone pulled the chain from his neck before the fall. Hardinge frowned. "You think he was pushed?" "I think," said Poirot, "that the tide of 30 years has come full circle. The first crime was born of love and fear. This one of silence and greed." That evening, back at Greyhaven Hall, Poirot asked for the household to gather in the drawing-room. The fire crackled. The wind rattled the windows. Faces flickered in the lamplight. Lady Margaret, pale and drawn. Clara, hollow-eyed. Beatrice standing stiff as a sentinel. "My friends," Poirot began softly, "a man is dead who should have lived to tell the truth. He kept secrets for you, Madame Margaret's secrets written in Helena's letters. And yesterday, when I found those letters, he knew exposure was near." Clara's head lifted sharply. "You think Aunt Margaret killed him?" Poirot raised a finger. "Non, non, patience. There is more than one form of guilt. Some kill with a hand, others with a lie." He moved to the table where a single candle burned beside the recovered locket. This trinket, voila, links the two deaths, Helena's and Holloway's. They were lovers. He helped conceal her accident to protect her husband and child. Years later, he helped forge the will that kept Greyhaven in the family. A man bound by devotion, until conscience broke him. Lady Margaret's voice was low. "He sent me a note the night he died. Said he needed to speak alone. I never went." Poirot regarded her gently. "No, but someone else did." He turned to the housekeeper. "Madame Beatrice, may I see your hands?" She blinked, startled. Her right hand bore a faint red mark where a ring had recently been removed. The bruise upon Holloway's neck, Poirot said quietly, was shaped just so. "You loved him once, did you not?" The old woman's composure cracked. "He promised he'd leave, that he'd stop blackmailing her ladyship. But when I heard him threaten her again when he said he'd take everything to the papers, I lost my head. I only meant to stop him talking." Her voice broke into sobs. "He slipped, there was rain, the cliff was slick." Poirot let the silence rest. The sea could be heard through the chimneys, slow and implacable. At last he said very gently, "Then the curse of Helena is ended not by ghosts but by human folly. You tried to bury one sin and uncovered another." Hardinge led Beatrice away. The door closed softly behind them. Later, Poirot stood alone in the library. The fire had burned low. The clock ticked with solemn dignity. He wrote a few lines in his notebook. First, death accident. Second, panic. Third, concealment. All bound by love, twisted into fear. He looked toward the darkened window where the reflection of the waves shimmered faintly. The tide withdraws, he murmured. Yet it always returns, and with it, the truth. He extinguished the lamp. Chapter 9. Poirot assembles the pieces. Morning returned to Greyhaven with a washed-out sky, pale as porcelain after the storm. The scent of salt and damp earth drifted through every corridor, as though the sea itself had come to peer in at the windows and whisper, "I told you so." Downstairs, Hercule Poirot sat at the breakfast table, his eggs untouched, his gaze fixed on the curling steam of his coffee. Hastings, who had arrived late the previous night from London at Poirot's urgent telegram, watched him with habitual perplexity. 3 deaths in as many days, Hastings muttered. "And you sit there as if you're waiting for the morning post." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, mon ami, sometimes the most revealing letters are not delivered by the postman, but by the conscience. One waits, and the truth, she arrives in her own time." Hastings sighed. "You mean to tell me you still don't know who killed Helena Grey 30 years ago, or who killed Holloway now?" Poirot lifted one elegant hand. "Au contraire." "I know both, Hastings. The difference is that now, at last, I understand why." He rose, brushed a non-existent speck from his sleeve, and walked to the window overlooking the cliffs. Below, the waves crashed against the rocks, steady and cold as judgment itself. By noon, the drawing-room had been prepared. The household, smaller now, heavy with unspoken shame, gathered around the long table, where Poirot had arranged several curious objects, the twin gold lockets, the old diary of Sister Madeleine, a faded photograph of Helena Grey, and a small silver crucifix tarnished by sea air. Lady Margaret sat nearest the hearth, pale but composed, her black dress immaculate as ever. Clara stood beside her, restless and watchful, while Inspector Harding remained near the door. His expression carefully neutral. Poirot took his place at the head of the table. "My friends," he began, "we have passed through tempest and tragedy together. But before we speak of the future, we must look once more into the mirror of the past. For it is the past, toujours le passé, that dictates every crime at Greyhaven." He opened the diary. Its pages were brittle, the ink faded. Here Sister Madeleine wrote of a young woman who came often to the Abbey's chapel to pray for forgiveness. She called her the Sapphire Widow, a name chosen for her eyes, blue and bright as sin. This woman, I have learned, was Helena Grey. Margaret stiffened. "You mean my sister?" "Yes," said Poirot quietly. "Your elder sister, the one whose death you called an accident." He paused. "But it was not an accident, was it, Lady Margaret?" She looked away, her voice no more than a breath. She fell. "I told you that." Poirot's eyes softened, but his tone sharpened. "No, madame." She was pushed. And the hand that pushed her was not moved by hatred but by desperation. A gasp escaped Clara. "You mean someone killed her out of love?" Poirot nodded. "Just so. She was with child, not her husband's. The truth, if revealed, would have destroyed the family name. There was a struggle and argument by the cliffs, and in her panic, Lady Margaret struck her sister. A single blow, a slip upon whetstone, and tragedy was born." Margaret's hands trembled. "I tried to save her," she whispered, "but she fell before I could reach her. Jasper helped me. He told me to say it was an accident, for the sake of the child, for the family." "And the child?" said Poirot softly. "He lived." "Did he not?" A long silence followed. Then Clara spoke, voice hollow. "What child?" Poirot's gaze turned to her, full of pity and precision. "Mademoiselle, that child was you." The room froze. The only sound was the fire snapping in the grate. Margaret let out a broken sound between a sob and a sigh. "I raised her as my own. No one knew, no one but Jasper. Helena's shame was buried, and Greyhaven survived." Clara staggered back as if struck. "You mean Aunt Margaret?" "You're my mother?" Poirot inclined his head. "By blood, no. By love, yes. The truth was buried beneath good intentions. But such lies, they have a half-life, n'est-ce pas? They decay, and the fumes of guilt rise again." Hastings swallowed hard. "Then Holloway's blackmail. was built upon this secret, said Poirot. He loved Helena once, but when she died he became her ghost, haunting those who kept her memory hidden. When Lady Margaret refused him money, he threatened to reveal the truth. Beatrice, who loved both him and her mistress, struck him down to protect them. But the sea, Hastings, she does not forget. She returns all that is cast into her depths. He turned to Margaret again. You see, madame, every death in Greyhaven was a ripple from that single moment by the cliffs. Your silence saved no one. It merely postponed judgment. Margaret closed her eyes. So what happens now? Poirot bowed his head. Now you tell the truth to those who remain and pray it sets them free. He turned toward the window. Outside the sea was calm again, gleaming beneath a fragile sun. Hastings followed Poirot into the hall afterward. Good Lord, Poirot, you might as well have torn down the house itself. Poirot looked at him gravely. Perhaps I have, mon ami, for Greyhaven was built upon a foundation of deceit. Better it crumble than stand upon such ground. He reached for his hat, adjusted it with delicate precision, and murmured, When love is buried beneath lies, it becomes a ghost that walks the corridors forever. And with that, Hercule Poirot stepped out into the waning light, the waves hissing softly below the cliffs, as though applauding his final bow. Chapter 10. The last bell of moonrise the following morning broke with a muted brilliance. The storm that had battered the cliffs had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean of all but the faintest silver wisps. The sea stretched far and still, a vast sheet of blue-grey glass whispering softly against the rocks. At the edge of the cliffs stood Moonrise Abbey, its spire catching the morning light. The mist had gone, but the air was heavy with remembrance, as though the house itself knew that its long-kept secret had finally been spoken aloud. Hercule Poirot stood before the chapel, his coat buttoned against the lingering chill. Inside, a small gathering took place, a quiet service for the dead. Beatrice, the maid who had taken her own life in fear and remorse, Mr. Holloway, the solicitor whose greed had turned to tragedy, and Helena Grey, the woman whose death had been the first note in this mournful symphony. The bell above the chapel was tolling, slowly, deliberately. Each sound seemed to hang in the air longer than the last. When the ceremony ended, Poirot lingered outside, gazing across the grey horizon. Hastings joined him, hat in hand, looking unusually subdued. She's gone, he said softly. Lady Margaret? Asked Poirot. Yes. The inspector says she'll be taken to London this afternoon. She confessed everything. They don't think she meant to kill her sister. Poirot nodded. No, but in concealing the truth she killed herself a little each day. Voila, Hastings. That is often the nature of guilt. It is not a blade, but a burden. The longer one carries it, the heavier it becomes until it breaks the soul beneath its weight. Hastings glanced toward the Abbey windows, where Clara stood motionless, looking out toward the sea. And the girl. What becomes of her? She will return to her teaching, I think, said Poirot. But she will not be the same. Truth, mon ami, is like the tide. Once it comes in, it changes the shape of the shore forever. For a time, neither spoke. The wind stirred faintly, ruffling Poirot's immaculate moustache. Somewhere far off a gull cried, the lonely sound of freedom above a house full of ghosts. At last Hastings said, It's a strange thing, Poirot. All these years. The legend of the Abbey, the curse, the bells, the sea, and in the end it wasn't fate at all. It was just people. Poirot smiled gently. Mais oui. Always, my friend. It is never the supernatural, no matter how the world wishes to believe it. The darkest hauntings are those of the heart, jealousy, pride, fear, love unconfessed. There are no ghosts but the ones we make for ourselves. He turned toward the path leading down to the village, his steps measured and precise as ever. Hastings followed, glancing back once at the ancient abbey. Its stone walls gleaming in the light like an old photograph faded at the edges. Behind them, the final bell began to toll. Once, twice, 3 times, and then silence. Poirot paused. You hear it, Hastings? That is the last bell of Moonrise Abbey. It tolls not for the dead, but for the living, those who must go on. He looked out to the sea one last time, his eyes soft with reflection. The sea, she keeps no secrets. She gives back all that man would hide in time. Remember that. And then, with a small, almost wistful smile, He descended the path toward the waiting motor car, his silhouette small against the boundless morning. Behind him, the abbey stood still once more, its windows gleaming faintly, its bells silent at last. Somewhere within its ancient stones, the echoes of prayer and betrayal faded into quiet, and the sea rolled on below, endless and forgiving,